The Greenskins in battle are perhaps one of the most on-point factions, since they act exactly like you'd expect them to. Pretty much every unit falls into the no defend, only attack category, with low defenses outside of any armor in exchange for high attack and damage. This makes them into a faction that can easily snowball if they get an early lead, but can just as easily fall very far behind if they start the battle on the back foot. Let's first go over the pros and cons of the roster overall. First of all, the pros, they have a very strong melee focused roster with a lot of powerful high damage infantry for each stage of the game. They also have a wide selection of monsters to bolster the front lines with even more damage. And finally, they have quite a fast roster in general with decently high speed across the board, including a decent sized cav roster. As for the cons, their lack of defense does leave them vulnerable to taking a lot of damage pretty much every battle, meaning replenishing can take up much of your time. Much of their army also requires quite a bit of micromanagement to get the most out of them, be it cav, very high damage front lines, or units with powerful abilities. And finally, they have a very limited selection of magical laws, with one being top tier, one being super mid, and one being bottom tier, meaning you basically have one choice if you really want to min-max it. Just before we get into the roster, they also have the army ability, known as the War. This is an ability that can only be activated once a bar is filled up on the right hand side of the screen. Every entity you have in combat will add to this bar, and once it's full, you can trigger a War to buff every single unit in the army. By default, this buffs all weapon damage, attack, and grants immunity to psychology to all units in the army for the duration. Each legendary lord also has a War of their own that has slightly different effects. Once the War is over, the counter resets, now requiring double the original cost, meaning you can have multiple in the same battle if you keep fighting for long enough. Now let's get into the roster. First up we have the Lords, and first up we have Grimgor Ironhide. He's armoured, deals armor piercing damage, and is a melee expert. He also has access to the Your Next ability right out the gate. He's a powerful frontlines battler with high damage and brilliant melee stats, so can take on basically anything and is great versus infantry or single targets like Lords and Heroes. Just keep him safe from being focused from a range and kited, as his slower speed makes him easy to outrun, leaving him vulnerable to being shot to ribbons. Next we have Ashag the Slaughterer. He's a spellcaster, is armoured, and deals armor piercing damage. He has access to the Law of Death. He's another great battler with high melee stats and damage. He also has that Law of Death, and while it's not the best law, it's decent, allows him to get some spell value as well as raw combat. You can use him quite similar to Grimgor, he's just not quite as good at battling. Keep him central whatever he's doing to provide the spell support wherever needed. He also has access to one mount, Skull Muncher. This puts him on a manticore, allowing him to fly at high speed and get a massive increase to charge bonus and weapon strength. It also drops melee stats and increases hitbox size, so makes him a lot more dangerous to use in sustained combat against anything with any real damage. Use him to charge into back lines and take them out in sustained combat before coming back to cycle charge the front lines to make the most of that bonus, whilst casting wherever needed. Next we have Skarsnik. He deals armor piercing anti-large damage, has charge defense versus large, and poison attacks. He's a bit of a strange lord since he has okay melee stats with great damage but mediocre armor. This makes him very hard to choose a fight for. Send him in versus anything with a lot of armor but not a lot of damage to make the most of his damage but keep him safe. If you can also make use of his anti-large bonus, then even better. Just don't let him get surrounded by any decent damage, as he will quickly fall apart when focused by even moderate damage units. Next up we have Wurzag. He's a spellcaster and has Frenzy, and has access to Law of the Big War. Wurzag is very much your average spellcaster lord. He has pretty poor melee stats for a lord, low damage, armor, and even with his resistance he's a pretty easy target. Keep him safe to make the most of his casting since his law is great. As long as he's alive and maybe encouraging units, he'll be doing just fine. He also has access to one mount, Spleen Ripper. This puts him on a warball, granting a boost to movement speed, charge bonus, and armor piercing damage. This makes him into a powerful charger with decent damage as well as a fantastic caster. Use him to cycle charge rather than sustained combat as his melee stats still aren't great, so he'll go down fast versus high damage foes. Now our final legendary lord is Grom the Paunch. He's armoured, deals anti-infantry damage, and has regeneration. Grom is of course a charging machine of a lord with a massive charge bonus alongside decent damage, albeit not massively armor piercing. Use him to charge in and out of enemies using his large mass to carry him through. Don't leave him in combat as his melee stats are pathetic and his large hitbox will spell a quick doom once locked down. First of our generic lords is the Goblin Grey Shaman. These are spellcasters with access to the Law of the Little War. These are your very basic spellcasters. No real melee prowess of their own with very low attack and defense and weak damage. Keep them on the backlines and casting to support their army, and do not engage in combat unless they have no choice, and even then, look for the weakest targets you possibly can. They also have access to 3 mounts. The Giant Wolf grants a nice boost to speed, as well as a little more charging bonus. Still want to avoid combat as much as possible, and only cycle charge if they're going to get in any combat. Mainly just use extra speed to keep them safe and get spells wherever needed. The Goblin Wolf Chariot drops some melee stats and overall weapon strength from the Giant Wolf to gain a nice chunk of charge bonus and a bonus versus infantry. It can now be used like any other chariot to charge in and out of enemies. As long as you can keep on top of the micro, it's a good upgrade and gets a lot more damage. Just don't send him in and forget to get him out, as the large hitbox will result in a near instant death. And finally, they have access to the Arachnarok Spider. This drops some speed and charge bonus from the chariot to gain a ton of HP, armor, melee stats and damage, as well as a mounted range team on its back. This massive monster mount is great for frontlines combat and makes Lord a viable threat here as well as a powerful caster. Just be cautious of enemy ranged, as the large hitbox makes him a very easy target. Next up we have the Knight Goblin Warboss. These are shielded melee experts and have poison attacks. These are basic combat lords with decent melee stats and damage, but not much armor piercing. The poison helps make up for this, but they are still fairly weak. Send them into the front lines to support with damage and aura buffs, but target lower armor and damage enemy units to keep them alive and dealing damage. They also have access to one mount, the Great Cave Squid. This brings buffs to speed, charge bonus, and a nice bit of armor piercing damage with a bonus versus infantry. Makes Lord into a little more of a charger that can still throw down in melee not too badly. The hitbox is still small, so they're not in too much extra danger. Still be cautious of high damage, as they don't have the most armor. And finally we have the Orc Warboss. These are armoured and shielded. These are very similar to the Night Goblins in the sense they're front lines lords, but they are basically better in every stat but defense. They have decent melee stats and pretty good weapon strength with armor piercing. Send them into the front lines versus basically anything early on, and they'll do great work. They also have access to a couple of mounts. The War Boar brings similar improvements to Spleen Ripper, so better speed, charge bonus and damage. The Orc Boar Chariot drops melee stats for a big chunk of charge bonus, making him into a powerful charging lord if you can manage the micro. And the Wyvern, which loses some charge bonus to become a lightning fast flying unit with powerful damage and melee stats. Not the toughest unit in the game, so keep him out of high damage clumps if you can. Target backlines before coming back to assist on the front from a safe angle. Now we come to the heroes, and first up we have the Black Orc Big Boss. These are armoured and shielded and are melee experts. These are similar to the Orc War Bosses but trade a few stats. Notably they have less armor piercing damage, but more armor, making them tougher but less damaging. Put them on the front lines to keep your army confident and provide some tanking and damage support. Honestly, they're very straightforward frontlines heroes. They have access to a War Ball mount. The Goblin Big Boss is a shielded duelist. These are very similar to the Night Goblin Big Bosses, but with no poison damage. They still have low armor piercing damage and decent melee stats, so chuck them into combat versus low armor and damage enemies to make the most of them while keeping them alive. You can target enemy heroes like weak casters to make the most of their duelist, and the eventual abilities to live up to their assassin role. They also have access to 3 mounts. The Giant Wolf, the Giant Spider, which loses some speed from the Wolf but gains some charge bonus and armor as well as poison damage. This is more or less just an alternate to the Wolf if you want to do some charging and the massive speed isn't as important to you. And the Goblin Wolf Chariot. The Giant River Troll Hag is a spellcaster, has slimy shanks, which basically means it just gains benefits when fighting in water, has the overwhelming odor ability, regeneration, and is aquatic. And also has access to Law of Death. These are single entity trolls, and so they behave like one. They have low melee stats but high armor piercing damage, as well as their Law of Death. Use them to bring spell support wherever needed, whilst getting them into combat versus anything that's high armor and low damage to make the most of their weapons whilst keeping them safe. The Night Goblin Shamans are spellcasters that come with Vanguard deployment and poison attacks, and the Law of the Little Waa. These are the little versions of the Great Shamans. Basically, use them the exact same. Keep them safe at the back of your army and cast where needed to support your troops. Avoid combat at all costs to keep them alive, nothing more to it. And finally we have the Orc Shamans. These are pure spellcasters with access to the Law of the Big Waa. These are pretty much just much weaker versions of Wurzag. They have the same law and can be used much the same, but with even worse stats. Keep them safe at the back of your armies, casting wherever needed, and avoid combat as much as possible, and they should be fine. And they also have access to one mount, the War Boar. Now we come to the melee infantry. First up we have Goblins. These are a tier 1 unit, are shielded, expendable, and have poor leadership. These are your weak line-holding infantry. They'll do fine in the early game versus early foes, holding them in place for a short time. Bring them as much support as you can in any form you have to do all the real damage. They are weak versus basically everything, so don't be too picky what they fight, just hold the enemy still while the rest of your army does all the work. Night Goblins are a tier 1 unit, are shielded, have poison attacks, are expendable, and have poor leadership. Somehow, they lose defense and armor from Goblins, but gain improvements to nearly every other stat as well as poison damage. You can still use them pretty much the same to hold enemies still and now weaken them with the poison. Still give them as much support as you can to keep them alive and take out enemies. You could also use their Stalk and Vanguard to have them flank, but their low damage won't make them too impactful in this role, so I wouldn't really bother doing it against most enemies. They also come in another variation, the Night Goblin Fanatics. These are another tier 1 unit, and the only difference is they gain the Spinning Loons ability. Use them the same and use the loons to deal some damage just before clashing with enemy lines to soften up their forces. Next up we have Orc Boys. These are a tier 1 unit and are shielded. These are a little slower than the Goblins but gain improvements to every stat, making them into an actually decent front line. Still, use them pretty much the same, head straight into combat and hold the enemy still, while you bring in more damage. They are technically a damage dealer frontline, but still provide them with support versus anything they can fight back against to ensure they get the win without taking too many hits. Nasty Skulkers are a tier 1 unit, have armor piercing damage, vanguard deployment, stalk, poor leadership, and the smoke bomb ability. These are a flanker melee infantry, and so come with higher speed, vanguard and stalk, allowing them to get around enemy lines fairly easily. Use them to do this and sandwich front lines between them and your line holders to wipe them out as quickly as possible. Their high weapon strength and opportunist murder passive will allow them to take out most early units with ease by doing this. Do not let them fight anything in a fair fight, as their pathetic defense will get them killed in moments versus basically anything. Savage Orcs are next up, and these are a tier 1 unit. Are damage dealers with Frenzy and come with War Paint, which essentially grants them 25% physical resistance. And if you know you won't be up against any magical damage, they're a great pick. Their lack of armor is made up by their physical resistance, so against non-magical sources of damage, they can be tough and do some decent work with their decent attack and damage. Against any magical damage, however, they fall apart in moments, and in this economy, in this map, there is plenty of that, so it's hard to recommend them. Still, if you do take them, use them the same as Orc Boys. They'll do some okay damage, but still toss support their way to ensure they're doing the most they can be. Next up we have Orc Biggins. These are a tier 2 unit, are damage dealers, and a bigger Armada, which means bigger Armada. These are a direct upgrade to Orc Boys, with improvements to basically every stat. This makes them tougher and more damaging with a new bonus versus large. Use them pretty much the same, so support them with whatever you can to keep the pressure on enemies and keep these lads alive as long as possible. The anti-large bonus damage is a nice addition, but I wouldn't seek out targets to make the most of this, and instead just have them on your front lines, as your front lines wall, taking on whatever comes their way. We also have Savage Orc Biggins. These are a tier 2 units, are damage dealers, a bigger Armada, and have that War Paint physical resistance. Shockingly, these are pretty much the same to regular Biggins as the Savage Orcs were to the Orc Boys. Less defense for a little more offense and speed. If you know there's no magical damage coming their way, then by all means, but otherwise stick to regular Biggins. They'll perform pretty much the same, so use them the same and give them the same support as much as you can. And finally, we have Black Orcs. These are the one and only tier 3 melee infantry unit, are armored and deal armor piercing damage. These are the final form of the Greenskins front lines, with massive damage, armor, and leadership, making them a nearly unshiftable wall of metal that deals a ton of damage while it's holding enemies there. Still provide as much support as you can to keep them alive and take out enemies as fast as possible. Despite their impressive stats, melee attack and defense don't start out great, so until they've got some levels under their belt, they'll take a lot of hits. Now we come to the ranged infantry. First up we have Goblin Archers. These are a tier 1 unit, are expendable, weak versus armor, and have poor leadership. Basically, even weaker goblins in melee, but now they have some meager range damage to make up for it. It's not a massive range or huge damage, but they'll provide steady support at anything they can shoot close to. Focus their fire on less armored foes to make the most of their damage if you can, keep them safe in your backlines to make the most of their firing arcs, and they should do some decent support. Just don't let them get caught in melee, as they will literally fall apart in seconds. We also have Knight Goblin Archers. These are a tier 1 unit, come with vanguard deployments, poison attacks, expendable, and now weak versus armor. These get some improvements to melee stats, but the range stays mostly the same aside from the addition of poison damage. You can still use them pretty much the same on the back lines, avoiding any melee and supporting front lines wherever possible. The poison makes them a little better if you spread the damage across the entire enemy lines to get that debuff on every unit you can, rather than focus firing, since the damage isn't really going to make that much of a difference anyway. And they also come in a variation, Fanatics. The only difference is, they have the spinning loons. Try to get them on the flanks of enemies if you can to get the ability off, before retreating to safety to provide fire support. Next up we have Orc Arrow Boys. These are a tier 1 unit, are a decent melee combatant, and have poor accuracy. These have more range and damage than the goblins, but their poor accuracy means it's possible that all of this damage will actually land on enemies, so make sure they have a clear shot on the stationary units to give them the best chance you can. Other than that, use them the exact same as goblins. Same at the back and range support wherever needed. The damage is still not the most armor piercing, so less armored enemies are preferred. And finally we have Savage Orc Arrow Boys. These are a tier 1 unit, are a decent melee combatant, have poor accuracy, and that War Paint physical resistance. These have the exact same stats for range as the regular orcs, but gain some changes to their melee stats, and of course drop all armor in exchange for physical resistance. I don't see any reason you should go these guys, since avoiding damage at all times should be the plan anyway, so going with resistance and better melee stats is pretty pointless. If you do get them, then use them the same as the regular Arrow Boys. Next up we come to the Cavalry. First up we have the Goblin Wolf Riders. These are a tier 1 unit, are shielded, and are very fast. These blazingly fast cav are great in the early game for taking out enemy ranged. Their damage will do fine versus low armor backlines, but their poor melee stats will make them pathetic versus anything they can fight, so keep them safe from being pinned down. If your target has some fight in them, then send these lads in 2-on-1 to make sure they get the job done. Otherwise, just focus on picking apart the backlines and anything that's already retreating. They're basically warhounds, so use them like any other similar unit. Next up we have the Forest Goblin Spider Riders. These are a tier 1 unit, are shielded, and have poison attacks. These swap some speed for improvements to most other stats, as well as gaining poison damage. I'd still use them pretty much the same, just now enjoy them doing the same job, just a little bit quicker. The reduced speed does make them easier to catch out, so plan their paths more carefully to keep them safe. If you do this, they should do the same job, even better than Wolf Riders. Next up we have Night Goblin Squig Hoppers. These are a tier 2 unit, are armoured, deal anti-infantry damage, have vanguard deployment and poison attacks. These are a bit of a strange step since they lose defense and armor from spiders but gain improvements to all other stats including armor piercing and a bonus versus infantry. I'd still use them mostly the same since their melee stats are still pretty low, so frontlines combat would be a bit dicey. Some cycle charging on the front lines after the back is taken out should be fine, but with their defense, sustained combat would be a death sentence. Next up we have the Orc Boar Boys. These are a tier 2 unit, are shielded, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage. Now we're getting into the territory of shock cavalry. They lose some speed from Squig Hoppers as well as attack, but gain a nice chunk of charge bonus and armor, so work well with cycle charging. Get them around and focus on the backlines first before turning their attention to the front. Cycle charge between the two if possible to make the most of their sizable bonus, and whatever you do, don't let them sit in combat versus anything that can fight, otherwise their low stats will come to really bite them in the ass. We also have Savage Orc Boar Boys. These are tier 2 units, come with armor piercing anti-infantry damage and war paint. Same story as usual with Savage units, pretty much the same as the base unit but less defense, more attack whilst dropping all armor in exchange for physical resistance. If you know there's no magic, go right ahead. If you don't know there's no magic, and let's be honest, in this game, you probably don't, then stick to the base unit. So stick to the base unit, because why would you ever go this? I don't understand. Anyway, Orc Boar Boy Biggins are next. These are a tier 2 units and deal armor piercing anti-large damage and a bigger Renada. These see improvements to armor, defense, damage, and charge bonus, while somehow not losing any speed. Use them the same as the regular Orc Boar Boys, but now they'll do even more damage. Still keep up the cycle charging to maximize their damage and keep them alive, and they should do great. And we also have Savage Orc Boar Boy Biggins. These are tier 3 units, deal armor piercing damage, a bigger Renada, and have war paint. Same story as before, less defense, more damage, versus no magic, go for it, otherwise just stick to the base unit. And finally we have Orc Boar Chariots. These are tier 3 units, are armoured, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage. These aren't quite as tough as Orc Boar Boy Biggins, but have a massive damage potential with their huge charge bonus and respectable weapon strength. Like any other chariot, use them to charge in and out of enemy lines, keeping them on the move at all times. Do not let them get pinned down at all costs, as their large hitboxes and poor defense will result in a quick death if they get stuck in combat. Next up we have the Missile Cavalry and Chariots. First we have the Goblin Wolf Rider Archers. These are a tier 1 unit, are very fast, weak versus armor, and have poor leadership. These are weaker versions of the regular Wolf Riders, but now come with ranged weaponry to do some very minor damage. Stick them on skirmish and send them around to fire into the backs of enemy lines, or have them kite enemies around the map to exhaust them whilst dealing some damage. The damage isn't amazing, so focus on less armored targets to maximize their value. Next we have the Forest Goblin Spider Rider Archers. These are a tier 1 unit, have poison attacks, and a weak versus armor. Similar to the melee version, these lose some speed to gain improvements to nearly everything else. The range damage is the same, but they have more ammo and it's poison, so you'll want to spread this across as many foes as possible to get that debuff on the entire front line if you can. Aside from this, you can use them the same, so stick them on skirmish and keep them safe and kite enemies or fire into their backs, whichever works best for you. The damage still isn't great, but the real value here is the debuff, not the damage. And finally we have Goblin Wolf Chariots. These are a tier 1 unit and deal anti-infantry damage and are very fast. These are a semi-viable early game chariot unit that you'll want to use just like the melee boar chariot to get the most value. The range damage will just happen passively as they do this, so as long as you focus on keeping them moving and charging, you'll get plenty of value. Now we come to the monsters and beasts. First up we have the Squig Herd. These are a tier 1 unit, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, are damage dealers, but are prone to going on a rampage. These are a great early game frontline support monster with a nice bit of damage to beef up that weak output at this time. Send them in alongside your melee infantry to keep them safe and allow them to deal damage without too much risk to themselves. Be aware of them going on a rampage upon taking too much damage, so just make sure they're in a safe spot and aren't going to run in too deep and get themselves killed if you don't manage them correctly. Next up we have Trolls. These are a tier 2 unit, come with armor piercing damage, regeneration and poor leadership. These get a massive buff in their damage over squigs with a ton of weapon strength, armor piercing and even passable melee stats. Use them pretty much the same to beef up front lines, but now they'll deal even more damage with massive area armor piercing attacks. Just be careful of their low leadership, as if they start to take too many hits they'll lose confidence quick and retreat in no time. Try to pull them out before this happens and give them a breather to regen some HP and gain back some leadership before sending them in for more. We also have a couple of variations of Trolls. River Trolls are a tier 3 unit and come with slimy shanks, an aquatic, and the overwhelming odor ability. These lose little damage in exchange for some slightly improved defense. You can still use them pretty much the same, and they'll do pretty much the same whilst being a little bit more survivable. We also have Stone Trolls, which are tier 3 units and come with armor piercing damage, scaly skin, which is missile resist, regeneration and poor leadership. These instead go for full damage with improved weapon strength and charge bonus, as well as a tiny little bit more armor. This makes them just into a much improved regular troll, so deal a ton of damage while staying somewhat alive versus non-armor piercing. Still, use them all the exact same, so pull them out once their leadership goes low, and they should do great work for you. Next up we have the Giant. This is a tier 3 unit, deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage and causes terror. Giants, giants, giants. What can I say that hasn't already been said? They're massive, slow-moving pincushions, so if the enemy has any range at all, they'll go down in moments, especially with their lackluster armor. If you know the enemy will have no or very little ranged units, then go right ahead, since they're actually pretty good versus melee clumps. But otherwise, leave them in the recruit menu, as they're just a loss at character select. Next we have the Arachnarok Spider. This is a tier 3 unit, is armored, deals armor-piercing anti-large damage, and has poison attacks. These can fall victim to the same problem as the Giants, but their slightly short hitbox and huge armor and speed makes them a little safer to use, so they're a pretty great frontlines monster. Still focus on taking out range with other units before this guy gets too close to keep them safe, but once the path is clear, send them deep into front lines. They do great damage in melee with massive armor piercing, poison, and even a bonus versus large if you can find them a target. Their ranged team on their backs will get even more passive value over the entire battle with the huge ammo pool, so as long as they're in or very close to enemies, they're doing great. And finally we have the Rogue Idol. This is a tier 3 unit, deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage, causes terror, is unbreakable, is cumbersome, which means very slow attacks, has the Spirit of Gork or Mork ability, and the Rubble and Ruin abilities. This means as it takes more damage, it deals damage to all units around itself and gains more weapon strength at the cost of losing armor. These are gargantuan monsters with huge HP bars, armor stats, and of course weapon strength. You can use them pretty much the same as the Spiders, since getting into as many enemy units as possible to deal huge damage with their area attacks is pretty much the entire strat. Still try to take out enemy range before they can get shots on these guys, as they're still massive slow targets, but their armor can keep them safe from all but the most vicious projectiles. Just bury them as deep in the enemy lines as you can, and they'll do great versus basically anything. Thanks to Rubble and Ruin, they'll be doing great even when they're losing from the massive damage they'll deal to everything around. And finally we come to the Artillery and War Machines. First up we have Goblin Rock Lobbers. These are a tier 2 unit and have armor piercing missiles. They're a pretty standard catapult unit with massive range and decent damage in that range. Set it at the back of your lines and pretty much forget it. The only real order it needs is picking any priority targets like higher armor clumps. Other than that, leave it to crack on and rain fire on the entire enemy army. Just keep it safe from being caught in any melee, as it will not survive versus basically anything. And we also have Doom Diver Catapults. These are a tier 2 unit, deal armor piercing damage, and have guided projectiles. These look to be a pretty minor upgrade over the Rock Lobbers since they only really gain a little bit more damage, but really they're a huge step up for a simple reason. The projectiles are now goblins in wingsuits instead of rocks, and in the air they'll control their flight path to ensure they hit their target, raising their accuracy and damage consistency by a large amount. You can even hop on a unit yourself and take it for a little test flight. Overall, still using the exact same at the back of your line, safe from being attacked, and they'll do great. Now we come to Snotling Pump Wagons. These are a tier 2 unit, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and are expendable. These are essentially slow-moving chariots that are a little bit of a step down from the boar chariots, but still decent when you get them in the game. They have decent mass, so can push through most mid-game infantry and deal some decent damage with their charge bonus, armor piercing, and anti-infantry damage. You can use them the same as chariots since all units like this work the exact same, so take out the back lines before coming back to the front, always making sure they stay on the move and avoid sustained combat wherever possible to avoid taking more damage than they need to. They also get a nice little boost to their speed when charging and the Pump Harder Lads passive, so keep them triggering this on cooldown for maximum impact. They also come in a couple of variations. The Flappers Snotling Pump Wagons are a tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage and are expendable. These gain improvements to most stats including a nice bit of speed and charge bonus. You still want to use them the exact same, just now enjoy more speed and devastating impacts. And these Spiky Rollers. These now gain unstoppable as well as armor sundering attacks. These instead keep the same speed and gain some melee attack, weapon strength, and armor sundering attacks as well as some toughness. Again, you can still use them the same, but now they'll be even better versus higher armor foes. Now comes to the Regiments of Renown. I'll call out each unit, what it's unit of, and the differences between it and the base unit. The Warlord's Boys are a Night Goblins unit, and swap poison for armor sundering damage, as well as losing expendable and gaining stalk. The 8 Peak Loonies are Night Goblin Fanatic units and lose expendable and gain unbreakable. The Crimson Killers are Black Orcs and gain attack, charge bonus, and anti-infantry bonus damage, and lose defense. The Rusty Arrows are Night Goblin Archers and lose expendable and swap poison for armor sundering missiles. The Moon Howlers are Goblin Wolf Riders and gain charge bonus and causing fear. Durkit Squigs are Night Goblin Squig Hoppers and gain defense, charge bonus, and missile resist. Broken Tusks Mob are Orc Boar Boy Biggins and gain armor, melee stats, and encourage. Morgrub's Mangy Marauders are Goblin Wolf Archers and gain charge bonus and armor piercing missiles, as well as gaining immunity to psychology. Death Creepers are Forest Goblin Spider Rider Archers and gain stalk and regeneration. Teeth Robbers are Goblin Wolf Chariots and gain speed, Vanguard Deployment, and Strider. The Swamp Things are River Trolls and gain weapon strength, charge bonus, causing terror and loses attack. The Arachnarok Queen is an Arachnarok Spider and gains the Maternal Instinct ability, which spawns a unit of spider hatchlings. The Big Un is a Rogue Idol and gains ranged attack and the Rock Bottom ability and loses melee defense. The Logie Bogies Spore Sploders are Snotling Pump Wagons and gain the Giant's Exploding Spores ability, and the Hammer of Gork is a Goblin Rock Lobbers unit and gains Blinded, Imbued Missiles whilst losing Expendable. You can also have some certain unique units appear in your War armies depending where you stand on the map when they are collecting. The Super Squig is a single entity Squig Herd unit. It is a single unbreakable Squig that is essentially a bloated corpse that can blow itself up with the Squig's Go Boom ability. The Lava Spider Rider Archers gain leadership, weapon strength, armor piercing damage, flaming attacks, and fire resistance. Armored Squig Hoppers gain armor and defense but lose charge bonus. The Feral Wyvern is essentially a beefed up Manticore, so a very powerful flying unit. The Feral Hydra is a War Hydra from the Dark Elves and just gains Rampage. And the Lava Ragnarok Spider gains leadership, flaming attacks, armor piercing range damage, the Ragnaruption and Thermal Thorax abilities, and fire resistance. And finally we come to army compositions. In Warhammer 3, every unit has a tier from 1 to 3, and I'm going to use these tiers to make you armies for the early, mid and late game, so you are set for every single step of your campaign. First of all, tier 1, we have a Goblin Great Shaman, 6 Orc Boys, 5 Night Goblin Archer Fanatics, 4 Squig Herds, and 4 Forest Goblin Spider Riders. The Goblin Great Shaman might sound like a poor choice since their lore is pretty weak and they can't really fight, but we are playing for the endgame with these lads. Early they won't do much, with weak spells and no impact, but later on, they'll come into their own. The Orc Boys are the best frontline you can get this time. They might not be the toughest, but they'll do a fine job dealing plenty of damage and allow you to roll most early forces, especially with support. The Fanatic Archers will provide with range support and spread their poison damage as much as possible to weaken the enemy force. If you can get them close enough to use these spinning loons, then safely do so for even more value. If not, it works as a good deterrent to anything that tries to flank them. The Squig Herds will get involved in the front lines and provide extra damage to push through whatever they come up against with relative ease, and the Spider Riders will be there to flank the enemy and target their ranged troops to keep your army protected. Coming to tier 2 now, still got our Goblin Great Shaman. We're now picking up an Orc Shaman. Our front line is now 6 Orc Biggins and 4 Trolls. We have 4 Night Goblin Archer Fanatics, 2 Night Goblin Squig Hoppers, and 2 Doomdiver Catapults. The Shaman should be on a mount and be a bit quicker to get around and support your armor with spells wherever needed. They're still weak, but by the end game, they'll be worth it. The Orc Shaman is here to bring a magical lore that's actually strong to the army and will be providing even more offensive spell support where needed and avoiding all combat. The Biggins are of course your line holder and will work with the Trolls to take out whatever the enemy throws at them. The Fanatics will stay pretty much the same. The Squig Hoppers will take on the role of the Spider Riders and do some charging on the back of the front lines when they're done. And the Doom Divers will provide that long range support, targeting the toughest targets of the enemy forces. Finally, we come to tier 3, our Goblin Great Shaman and the Orc Shaman leading the charge. We have 6 Black Orcs, 2 Ragnarok Spiders, 2 Rogue Idols, 4 Orc Boar Boy Biggins, and 4 Doom Divers. The Great Shaman will finally be on the Spider, so be an excellent fighter as well as powerful caster. The Orc Shaman will also be on their mounts, so be speedy getting around the map to cast where needed. You can also do some charging of their own if you can manage the micro. The Black Orcs will of course hold the line versus whatever the enemy sends at you to do some tasty damage, and the Spiders and Rogue Idol will help with the front lines to provide a big chunk of extra damage. Boar Boys will take on the back lines of the enemy force and keep your units safe from them before doing some cycle charging on the front lines, and the Doom Divers will do the same as before, just now there's 4 of them. That's everything you need to know on how to play the Greenskins in battle. We've got the Beastman campaign guide coming next, so subscribe if you want to see that. If you enjoyed this video and or found it useful, then consider dropping a like. And if you really enjoy the content and want to support directly, then consider becoming a member on YouTube or a patron on the Patreon. Doing so gets you early insights into future content, increased voting power, discounts on merch, as well as shoutouts at the end of videos like Henry took for his support at the officers tier. Thank you to all supporters. One last thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.